There is a photograph of my mother's house taken from the sidewalk on a spring morning in 1973. In it, a girl of 19 stands on the porch in a blue cardigan, looking out at the street. She does not know she is being photographed. She does not know that the young man holding the camera will be gone before autumn ends. She does not know that the image he is capturing will travel through 50 years and 2 pairs of hands before it comes to rest on a kitchen table on a cold November evening between a sealed letter and a daughter she has not seen since the day she was born. I am that girl, and last Sunday night I finally stopped carrying her alone. Thomas came back at 8:30. I heard his truck on the gravel the way I have heard it 1,000 times in my life, but that night the sound of it was different, fuller, like a sentence completing itself after a very long pause. I did not move from the kitchen table. Eleanor did not move. We sat in the lamplight and we listened to his footsteps on the porch steps, slow and deliberate, the footsteps of a man who has been driving around in the dark, thinking, and finally decided what he thinks. The door opened. He came down the hallway. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his green jacket with the collar still turned up, and he looked at Eleanor sitting at the table, and then he looked at me, and I looked back at my son, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said. The truth was already in the room. It had been in the room for 2 hours. All that was left now was what Thomas chose to do with it. He took off his jacket. He hung it on the hook by the kitchen door, the same hook where his father used to hang his jacket, where Thomas has been hanging his own jacket since he was tall enough to reach it. He pulled out his chair. He sat down. He said, without looking at either of us, "Is there any of that apple cake left?" I stood up. I cut him a piece. I put it in front of him, and I sat back down. And the 3 of us sat there in my kitchen in the November quiet, and nobody spoke for a while, and it was all right. It was the right kind of quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled, the kind that means everyone in the room has decided, without saying so, to stay. After a while, Thomas looked at Eleanor. He said, "How long have you been looking?" She said, 10 years. He said, "And before that?" She said, "I always knew I was adopted. I did not start looking until after my father died. It felt like something he would have wanted me to do, even though he never said so directly." Thomas looked down at his plate. He said, "Your father, Robert Hadley." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was Daniel's brother." She said, "Yes." He said, "So she," and he nodded toward me without looking at me, "has a daughter, and that daughter's father was the brother of the man who raised her." Eleanor said, "Yes, I know how it sounds." Thomas said, "It sounds like something that was supposed to happen and somehow kept almost not happening for 50 years. He looked up at Eleanor then, and something passed between them across my kitchen table, something that I did not have a name for but recognized, the particular recognition of 2 people who have been shaped by the same absence without knowing it, who both, in their different ways, have spent their lives in the gravitational pull of a loss that happened before either of them was old enough to understand what loss meant. I reached for the envelope in the center of the table, the cream-colored one, the one I had written on a gray February morning in 1974 and never sent. I held it in both hands. I said, "I would like to read this, if that is all right with both of you." Thomas looked at me. Eleanor looked at me. Neither of them spoke, but Eleanor put her hand on the table, palm up, and after a moment, Thomas put his hand next to hers, and I looked at the 2 of them sitting there on the other side of the table, my son and my daughter, and I understood that whatever happened next, I was not going to go through it alone. I opened the envelope. The paper inside was thin and slightly brittle, the way paper gets after 50 years, The handwriting was my own at 19, pressed too hard into the page, the way I always did, the ink slightly dark at the start of each word. I smoothed it flat on the table. I took a breath, and I began to read. I wrote it the night I came home from Burlington, February 14th, 1974. I told her that her father's name was Daniel Graves, and that he had dark hair and an easy laugh, and that he had loved me in the particular generous way that some people love, without reservation, without conditions, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told her that he had died before she knew she existed, and that I believed, with everything I had, that if he had known, he would have moved mountains. I told her I was not giving her away because she was unwanted. I told her she was the most wanted thing I had ever held in my life. I told her I was giving her away because I was 19 years old and alone and frightened, and I did not know yet that fear is not a good enough reason to let go of the things that matter most. I told her I was sorry. I told her she was warm. I told her I hoped there was someone who read to her at night and made her feel every single day that the world was glad she was in it. I stopped. I looked up. Thomas had his hand over his eyes. His shoulders were very still, the way a person goes still when they are holding something in that needs a moment before it can come out. Eleanor was looking at me with those grey-blue eyes of her father's, and her face was not sad exactly. It was something more complicated than sad, something that had grief in it and gratitude in it, and 50 years of not knowing and now knowing and understanding that both of those things were true at once and always would be. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I set it on the table between us, and then I said to both of them the thing I had been trying to say for 50 years without knowing how to begin. I said, "I am glad you are both here." That was all. I am glad you are both here. It was not the most eloquent thing I have ever said. It did not cover everything that needed to be covered or explain everything that needed to be explained, but it was true, completely, simply, exactly true. And sometimes the true thing is enough. Sometimes it is the only thing. Thomas lowered his hand from his eyes. He looked at me. He said, "I know, Mum." Eleanor reached across the table. She put her hand over mine. She said, "So am I." Outside my kitchen window, the first snow of December had begun to fall on Millbrook, soft and slow, the way the first snow always falls here, as though it is trying not to startle anyone. The maple tree in the front yard stood bare and dark against the white sky, its branches gathering snow along their length, the way old things gather what comes to them, quietly, without resistance. I am 71 years old. I have loved people imperfectly. I have been afraid when I should have been brave. I have been silent when I should have spoken. I have carried things that were too heavy and put down things I should have held. I have made the kinds of mistakes that cannot be undone, only outlasted, only slowly forgiven by the people you love and by yourself. But tonight, the table was set for 3, and all 3 chairs were filled. And the letter that I wrote in the winter of 1974, on a night when I felt more alone than I have ever felt before or since, had finally, after 50 years, been read out loud in a warm kitchen to the only 2 people in the world who needed to hear it. It was not a perfect ending. Life does not give those. There would still be mornings when Thomas would need to work through what he now knew. There would still be conversations between Eleanor and me that we had not yet found the words for.
There would still be the particular ache of all the years that were gone, the birthdays uncounted, the Christmases unshared, the ordinary Tuesdays that belonged to a life we did not get to live together. But we were here now, all three of us, in the same room, at the same table, in the same small light. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for staying with Margaret through all 7 parts of this story. If something in it stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you have been carrying, or a truth you have not yet found the courage to say, I hope it gave you a little of what Margaret found at the end, the knowledge that it is never too late, that the people who matter find their way back, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply set the table and wait. If Deep Life Stories has meant something to you, please subscribe and share this with someone you think needs to hear it. There are more stories coming, stories about real lives, real love, real loss, and the quiet, remarkable ways that people find their way back to each other. I will see you in the next one.